The purpose of this slide deck is to introduce sample variance curve fitting. We divide this slide deck into 3 videos. In this first video, we will develop a definition for the quantity called chi-squared. In the second video, we will introduce the idea of minimizing chi-squared during curve fitting. When fitting functions are selected appropriately, chi-squared often turns out to have a value in the neighborhood of the number of plotted points minus the number of adjustable fitting parameters. In the third video, we will present an algorithm that students in introductory undergraduate physical sciences laboratory courses can work through to apply the understanding developed in this slide deck to their own experiments. The methods and expressions that we will eventually present in the second and third videos take into account realistic situations in which our theoretical knowledge of the experimental system is limited. To develop our discussion, however, we first consider the simplified situation in which we have a model of the world that we regard as accurate. This provides a relationship between variable y and variable x. When making measurements at x equals x1, x2, x3, x4, and x5, we anticipate obtaining the vertical positions along the y-axis represented by the orange circles. We refine our model by acknowledging the presence of noise. For example, when working in a physics lab, we might reason that fluctuations in our measurements reflect a large number of small fluctuations from a variety of instrumental sources, and borrowing notions from the video tutorials on the central limit theorem, we would expect measurements to fall in Gaussian distributions centered on the so-called perfect yellow curve. One experiment might yield these 5 blue triangles. Repeating the experiment might then yield these 5 yellow stars, and another repetition might yield these 5 red squares. In this example, the triangles, stars, and squares do not coincide. Additionally, none of the experimental datasets precisely coincides with the so-called correct positions of the orange markers. Consider the particular experiment which yielded these 5 yellow stars. The red arrow indicates the vertical distance by which the y value of the 5th star is displaced above its corresponding ideal orange marker. We denote this vertical displacement delta y5 of star, where the parenthetic reference to star reminds us that this deviation is obtained particularly from the dataset star. In a similar fashion, we can identify vertical displacements between the other 4 yellow stars and their corresponding ideal orange markers. At a rough order of magnitude level, we anticipate that these deviations will often be similar in size to the standard deviations sigma of the Gaussian distributions from which the stars were drawn. What is the probability distribution function describing the likelihood of getting a first vertical displacement delta y1 of star, a second vertical displacement delta y2 of star, and so on, all in the one same experiment? In some situations, it is reasonable to say that the fluctuations of different individual measurements from their ideal values are statistically independent. In these special situations, the probability distribution factorizes into a first part, P1 of delta y1 of star, that depends only on the vertical displacement of the first star, a second part, P2 of delta y2 of star, that depends only on the vertical displacement of the second star, and so forth. For readers following along with pencil and paper at home, please note that we are playing fast and loose by talking about probabilities when we are working with probability distributions associated with continuous variables, meaning probability distributions that are to be used in the context of integrals. Substituting Gaussian distributions into each of these probability distribution factors, and then combining the terms in their individual exponents into a sum, as we are allowed to do when exponents are multiplied together, we obtain a probability distribution in which the standard deviations, those sigmas, of the individual Gaussians appear in a denominator, and in which ratios of squared deviations to variances appear together in the exponent in a sum. This sum constitutes the guts of the probability distribution, and we give it a special name, chi-squared. Chi-squared is a sum over normalized squared deviations. In the first term, the vertical deviation delta y1 of star is squared and then normalized by dividing by the variance sigma 1 squared of the corresponding first Gaussian distribution plotted at x1. The remaining terms in the sum are constructed analogously. Chi-squared is a way to express how far away the stars, as a collection of measurements, are from the theoretical curve. The bigger the disagreement between the collection of stars and the theoretical curve, the greater the chi-squared value. A negative sign appears alongside chi-squared in the exponential function in the probability distribution. Thus, the bigger the chi-squared value, the lower the probability p of getting such a set of stars from the given theory. That is to say, the lower the probability of drawing such a set of stars from the Gaussian distributions centered on the orange circles. In this example, we have written chi-squared as chi-squared of star to make explicit that this quantity is calculated using the data set of stars. Other values of chi-squared might result from instead using the data set of triangles, or instead using the data set of squares, or instead using any of a variety of other datasets not explicitly illustrated. In other words, a value of chi-squared can be calculated each time the experiment that yielded the stars is repeated. The average of chi-squared over a large number of such experiments is the number of measurements m in each experiment. Here m equals 5 because we are obtaining points at x1, x2, x3, x4, and x5. The viewer may pause the video to verify this equation by recognizing that each of the squared deviations in the equation for chi-squared turns into a variance upon averaging. In this video, we discussed statistical aspects of the displacements of a particular set of measurements, those stars, from a theoretical curve that was clearly specified and assuredly accurate. We knew exactly what yellow curve we were investigating. It was drawn without ambiguity. We now extend this discussion to a situation more relevant for research, in which the theoretical curve to be compared to experimental data is not itself fully specified. By pursuing this line of analysis, we will develop a procedure for reporting and assessing the quality of curve fits to data.